Hello, this is Strategy Miscellany here starting a campaign in Kerbal Space Program. Kerbal Space Program was released back in 2011 and in my opinion is probably the best game released in the 2010s. It's just amazing with the level of educational value it has, with the level of just goofy fun, with the creativity involved of what you can customize, and all the different things you can build. Anything from giant rockets to airplanes to submarines even, although those are quite difficult to get to actually work. And that you can travel around this miniaturized fictional solar system. Now, this looks a little bit different than the basic Kerbal Space Program starting screen, if you're familiar with it. I have two mods running right now. I have one called JNSQ, or JNSQ, that basically scales up everything by a factor of 2.7. So it makes it roughly 1/4 the size of the real solar system, as opposed to the baseline Kerbal system's 1/10 size. This makes the planets look a little bit less goofily small and makes it a little bit more difficult to get into orbit. On the real Earth, it takes something like 9,000 meters per second of delta V to get from the ground to low Earth orbit. On base game Kerbin, it takes something like 3,500. And with this, it takes something more like 5,000. Now, the other major modification is called EVE, or Environmental Visual Enhancements, and that's what's putting these pretty clouds on the planet. There should be auroras also up on the north and south poles, and there should be some nice cloud effects on other planets also. So let's start a new campaign. We're going to go with the science mode. I just don't really enjoy the career mode. I want to be able to build a rocket and decide where it's going to go myself and not have to follow some other idea of contracts. That may not be entirely realistic, but I'd rather just be able to say, I want to go to Mars today, or to Duna, or I want to build a probe to explore the outer solar system, and then just do it. But I do like the progression the science mode gives you, where you have to start with basically no technology and slowly unlock it over time by flying missions and getting scientific equipment into different sites around the solar system. I'm using Tsiolkovsky for the name. He was an early, basically visionary of rocketry in the 1890s in Russia. Came up with the famous rocket equation, which is how all delta V is calculated. And I like this kind of hexagonal circular flag. So we'll go with that. Now for difficulty, I'm not going to have missing crews respawn. And let's see, I'm going to include the plasma blackout effect. However, I am going to increase the range and the DSN modifier, basically just because the scale of our solar system is increased, and also this mod, the JNSQ, adds a lot of outlying planets to the system. It adds more outer planets than the baseline system has. We'll go ahead and enable Kerbal Experience, so they all start at just minimum experience and have to level up by doing things. We'll go ahead and include pressure, G-force, and Kerbal G-force limits. The parts can break under extreme circumstances, and if the G-forces are too high, the Kerbals can pass out. And we won't allow manually transferring resources through things where they shouldn't be able to. So, let us begin. So we start here at the Kerbal Space Center, at the equator, and let's go ahead and get the sun up, advance time a little bit. That's another part of the JNSQ mod, is that the sun has these spectacular lens flares. I think they look a little better in space than they do on the ground, but we'll be spending a lot of our time in space, so that's all right. All right, we've got a proper sunrise. Let's look at the tracking station and see what this solar system looks like, because this is not the real solar system. If you want the real solar system for Kerbal Space Program, that exists as a mod simply called Real Solar System. There's also a companion mod for it called Realism Overhaul that adds a lot of extra complications, realistic rocket fuel and engines that can't be restarted infinitely and can't throttle down very much, and having to deal with your liquid hydrogen boiling off over time, all that sort of thing. If you're interested, I definitely think it looks very interesting. There's some very impressive YouTube cinematics of people doing, say, crewed missions to the outer planets with it, and there's a lot of great YouTube content for it. I kind of like just using the stock parts, just basically building Lego spaceships almost. And so that's what I'm sticking with for now. The stock parts are not as good as real rockets in terms of how their thrust to weight ratio. They're denser or more overbuilt in a way. And they also have a little bit lower specific impulse than a real rocket engine can provide. But on the other hand, the reason for that is that Kerbin is 10 times smaller than Earth by default. I believe actually 10.6 times smaller. And so it takes a lot less delta V to get there. The other planets are closer together and also smaller, so the whole system takes a lot less delta V, so your parts are weakened a bit too. With this mod, the parts are still weak. We've got a slightly bigger system. It's going to make it a challenge to get to some of the outer planets, but I think it's a challenge we can meet successfully. So let's look in the tracking station. So this is Kerbin, got his beautiful ice caps. Looks like it's got some northern lights going on, and southern lights also. And we are in an equatorial launch site. That's very nice because we don't have to deal with getting into an equatorial orbit, and we get to take maximum advantage of the rotation of the planet. The Kerbal Space Program solar system is kind of easy mode for this sort of thing, in that there's no axial tilt on Kerbin. The moon is directly in the orbital plane of the equator. Minmus is not too different from that. So here we've got the moon, or the moon. Looks a lot like the real thing. It's typically your first target, although an alternative first target is Minmus over here, which is a little bit less candy green than the base game version. The JNSQ mod tries for a little bit of quote-unquote realism, and so the coloration of some of the bodies is a little less extreme. So that's Kerbin and its satellites, where we start. You can see there's a lot of near-Earth or near-Kerbin asteroids floating in space. Over here is Eve, which is kind of the Venus analog. It's got an exceedingly thick atmosphere, much like Venus, and is also larger and has a higher gravity than Kerbin proper. It has 1.4 Gs and 2,050 kilometer radius here, and its atmosphere reaches a 10 atmosphere pressure at the surface. And as you can see, we can't really see the surface from up here. I believe it's purple as in the base game once you get through the cloud layers, but we'll have to see that. Now Eve has Gilly orbiting it, basically a captured asteroid. You can see it's not entirely spherical, has some nice craters, and it's just a little tiny place, radius of 30 kilometers. Now, moving inwards, we have Moho, the Mercury equivalent. And it looks a lot like Mercury. Has no atmosphere, very close to the sun, so solar panels will work very well. And difficult to get to because of how close to the sun it is. Here's the sun. We zoom in. We get rid of that lens flare, we see the actual body. If you're this close in the game, your spaceship is probably on fire. And moving out, we have Duna, the Mars analog. And this mod makes it look a lot more like present-day Mars. The ice caps are a lot smaller. They're just these kind of little dots on the top and bottom. Instead of Phobos and Deimos, Duna has Ike, which is quite a large moon. Looks like it is radius of 210 kilometers, as compared to Duna's radius of 800 kilometers. And moving outward from there, we have Dress, the mimetically forgotten body of the Kerbal system. It's basically kind of a Ceres or Vesta analog. Hopefully this version still has the giant canyon on it that the base game Dress is famous for. We'll have to go out there and see. Now this game also adds another asteroid analog here. There it is, Edna. Which I suppose if Dress is Ceres, Edna is Vesta. Looks pretty similar. And Edna has a moon of Dak, which is, as you can see, small enough that it's not spherical, has only a radius of 20 kilometers. And moving out, we get to the Jupiter analog of the Kerbal system, Jewel, which the first thing you'll notice about it is that it's a blazing bright green. Really stands out, that's for sure. And it's got a lot of satellites. It's got Lathe, which is one of the most interesting bodies in the whole system, because it has an oxygen atmosphere that your Kerbals can actually breathe. And so you can send them out there, they can take their helmets off and walk around, and you can fly a jet airplane out here that'll actually work as an oxygen-breathing jet engine. So definitely have to get to Lathe sometime. Beautiful place. Then we've got Val. Val's more of maybe a Callisto type, I would say. Now, that's what I would say it's closest to, probably, is Callisto. Then we've got Tylo, which has been made a little bit smaller relatively in JNSQ than in the base game, and actually has its own atmosphere now, too. I think the modder decided it wasn't realistic to have such a high-gravity body that inexplicably had no atmosphere. But Tylo's sort of the Ganymede analog. And then we've got Bop here, which is one of those small outlying moons. And we've got Paul over here. Looks like a pollen grain, or so is the theory. Has some interesting spiky formations on its surface, if I recall. We'll have to get out there and take a look, too. Now, except for Edna and Dak, these are all base game bodies. But after this, we get into stuff that's been added specifically for the JNSQ mod. So we have Lindor, which looks like Neptune, but is probably supposed to be a Saturn analog. Would be the closest thing to it. But it definitely looks like Neptune more. Gorgeous blue, a little bit smaller than Jewel. We've got Krell here, fairly small, rocky planet. You could see it as sort of equivalent to Mimas maybe, or Enceladus, but doesn't really have the potential of life on it like Enceladus or the giant crater like Mimas. We've got Aiden here, which is a bit larger. Has a nice kind of brown color to it. And here we have the Titan analog of the system. We have Huygens. As you can see, thickly atmosphered, orange. Yeah, 1.5 atmospheres at sea level, 670 kilometers. This is your Titan analog. We'll have to go there sometime. Then we've got Riga, which also has an atmosphere and is fairly large. although it's quite a thin atmosphere, just 0.06 atmospheres at surface. But it's sort of an icy planet with its own. It's like if the moon had an atmosphere almost, so that's a little interesting. And Talos, out here at the edge of the Lindor system, fairly large actually, a 500-kilometer radius. Just for comparison's sake, we can go back to Kerbal here. Or sorry, not Kerbal, Kerbin. And its radius is 1,600 kilometers. So just for comparison, that's the radius of our Earth analog in this game, is 1,600 clicks, or about 1,000 miles. Meaning that the circumference, in terms of going around it, would be 2 pi r, so 3,200 times pi, so roughly something like, turns out to be roughly maybe something like 10,000 kilometer circumference. So here we have Elu, which in the base game is kind of the Pluto analog, and has remained the same here. Very icy, nice pattern of cracks on it. Looks like it would be interesting to maybe drive a rover through one of these canyons. And it has 2 moons now. It has Celis, which I believe is the the Charon analog. And then it has this outlying Tam here, which is probably a captured asteroid or something, quite small. Only 10 kilometer in radius. So, moving on from there, we have this purple one here, Hammock. Hammock is sort of a red Elu almost, if you will. I believe some of the real-life Kuiper Belt objects have a reddish cast to them, and that's where this is coming from. So then way out at the edge of the system, where it's extremely difficult to get to, we have Nara. Now Nara is sort of a Planet X analog, if you will. It's large, has an exceedingly thick atmosphere, although it must be not very cloudy or anything, because I don't see any clouds on it. But yeah, it's very big. It's 3,600 kilometer radius, so larger than Kerbin, although it's just 1 gravity, so less dense, probably a lot of ice. And it has an atmosphere with a surface pressure of 40 atmospheres. So this is going to be an extremely difficult planet to get home from if anybody goes there with an attempt to get home. We might have to just send probes out here. It would be a long way to go. We have Amos, which has a fascinating dark cast to it. Looks interesting. We have Enon, which is quite large. And then way at the edge of Nara's sphere of influence, we have Prax, small little place. Small, gray, not that interesting on the surface. Possibly the mod people have put interesting anomalies on the surface of that or some of these other outlying planets. I know I've heard of something with Nara that way, so we'll have to go take a look. But for now, we are a long way from getting to any of these outer planets. So let's build our first rocket. Well, first let's hire some more astronauts. Might as well have a whole batch of full astronauts here to choose from. So at the beginning, you really don't have very much to work with. You've got basic command pod, sort of a basic Soviet model command pod. And basically, you just snap things together like Legos. You got a parachute, stick that on there. You've got a solid rocket booster, not a very good one either. And, well, this is what you've got for your baseline vehicle. The good news is we'll be able to get some science from this and build a slightly better vehicle for our next flight. So what we're going to try to do is send our Kerbonaut up and have him or her not die, and come back with some scientific reports about what it's like to fly a rocket. And as you can see over here, we have 1153 meters per second of delta V. We're not going to reach orbit with this guy. We're just going to go up, get some pretty pictures of the Earth from high up, or of Kerbin from high up, prove that it has a nice curvature to it to any flat Kerbin believers out there, and return home. So let's put someone in on the crew. Sure, Growly Kerman, you get to fly this one. The pilots will really be having a lot more fun than the rest of our Kerbal types at first, until we can start getting some vessels that have crew capacity more than one. So we'll call this one Test 1, and we'll take it to the launch pad. Alright, we're on the launch pad, our flag flying in the corner, and first we'll just take a report from the launch pad with our little mystery goo science vessel here. It'll give us 3 science. Not very much, but humble beginnings. Turn on the guidance controls, have our pilot try and keep this thing stable. And 3, 2, 1, lift off. We go screaming into the sky on 3 solid rocket boosters. Lots of G-forces. So might as well take a report from the air here. And second stage. Now we can't actually discard the first stage in this case because we don't have the decouplers to do that yet, but in the future we will. I'm trying to turn this thing sideways a little bit so we don't just land on the launch pad and we can get some interesting scientific reports from somewhere else. And you can see we're reaching the cloud layer. This is something that Environmental Visual Enhancements, EVE, adds in, is these lovely cloud layers. And they really do make it feel a lot more like a real living planet. It really adds something. So much credit to the people behind Environmental Visual Enhancements. I'm going to do a crew report while flying over the lowlands, and we'll save our third goo canister for when we land. So we start falling down. Might as well deploy the parachutes. Now the parachutes are ready, and they're slowing us down a little bit, but they're not actually going to deploy until we reach 1,000 meters above the ground. This shows us our surface radar altitude. This shows us our absolute altitude above sea level. They're not very different in this case. If we were coming down over some mountains, they would of course be considerably more different. On the planets that don't have oceans, sea level is just kind of the lowest base altitude. On the planets that do have oceans, you can end up negative by building vessels that go beneath the sea. It's quite difficult, especially with the pressure limitations, and not really what the game is intended for, but we'll probably mess around a bit with it later. So, speeding things up here as we watch this fall. In the future, I'll probably put cuts in here, but In this case, figure you might as well want to see the whole flight from start to finish for the first flight of our program. And here we come down. Now, because we're moving so slowly, I can actually have our pilot get out and take a report while hanging off the side of this. It's a most precarious situation. Yes, I would agree. So back in you go. Don't do that when the ship is moving quickly, or your pilot will be launched off your ship. Now, they do by default bring along a personal parachute, so you would probably be able to save her, but if you were doing that during, say, the launching phase, you would definitely lose the ship. And if you hadn't deployed the parachutes yet, you would lose the ship also, because she wouldn't be on the ship to control it. So, generally not recommended unless things are going spectacularly wrong and you have to bail out. You can see there's a little bit of a glitch with sort of a gap showing beneath the runway. I believe that's because the runway is built assuming that the planet is flat, and the planet is of course not flat, and so the ground curves away a little bit below the runway. It could also just be that it's downhill there, and that's not accounted for. So there is that, but that's all right. All right, let's get a report from the mystery goo on the ground here in the lowlands. And let's get a... Oh, never mind. We'd have to overwrite the crew report. Let's not do that. So let's recover the vessel. So here we are, 27 science earned. We can go to the Science Center and start unlocking some new parts. So first they start us off with the basics here. Better solid rocket booster, basic liquid fuel engine and liquid fuel tank. Over here we get stacked decouplers so we can decouple and have a multi-stage rocket, a thermometer, an antenna. Good stuff. Now, we can only afford the cheapest of these, but it is a nice one. It gives us actual heat shields, which are going to be good if we're going to be coming in from actual orbital velocities. A nice pyrometer we can use to check some pressure, some radiator panels that won't really matter yet, and some extra parachutes here. These drogue chutes are nice if you're coming in hot, because they can survive and open at much higher velocities than the baseline chutes. And so they can get you slowed down enough that you can actually safely use the baseline chute. So, let's do flight number 2, and that's probably where we'll call it for this episode. So, flight number 2, ideally I would like to get us up to not an orbit, but a suborbital hop, get us above the atmosphere. So, let's put a heat shield on this capsule so that we can actually survive such a thing. And let's put some science instruments directly on the capsule so that we can take them home with us, because we're going to be detaching just the capsule this time. And we don't yet have a science container that we can use to just transfer all the experiments into. So, have to put everything on the capsule and hope it doesn't burn up in re-entry. Cover up our nice mission flag, unfortunately. So, this part's going to decouple. And as you can see, we can look at the staging of the system over here. So basically it goes from the bottom up. So right now the first thing that would happen is this would decouple. The second thing that would happen is the parachute goes. But of course we want to do some stuff before that. So let's have a liquid fuel stage, although we have these tiny little tanks, so it's going to be difficult to build one that's very long. But we'll go ahead and build a small liquid fuel stage, and then we'll try a couple of solid fuel stages below it. And we'll see how this goes. Now, another thing you can do over here is you can select this delta V option and you can say, well, what if I'm not worried about delta V at the surface? What if I'm worried about delta V out in space? Because most rocket engines will do better in space, and ones that are designed specifically for space will do much better in space. So this one does a little bit better. You see it give us 1566 delta V versus on the ground 1224. So that's our final stage. And then below that, we're going to have a stage of solid rocket boosters. Now let me look at what the thrust weight is on this guy. Okay, that's actually good enough that we can just use one. So we'll just have a 1 SRB stage. And then we'll have the lifting baseline stage here. Now, it usually makes sense to have your rocket decouple as it separates here. So basically, the next stage fires just as it is broken free from the previous stage. So let's do this. Give some nice trifold symmetry. And there's our beautiful baseline stage. And we don't have any really good fins yet, but we'll put these very basic stabilizing fins on and hope it doesn't crash. We are still at sort of the very early points of rocketry here. We'll call this suborbital 1. And, we'll go ahead and let Jeb fly this one. He's a daredevil. So we've got our science. We've got our crew capsule. We've got our engines. Let's cross our fingers and see how this one does. With the heat shield, it should, fingers crossed, be pretty survivable, no matter what happens. All right, here we are. Press Z to set thrusters to full. Add on the SAS. And then all you do is you press space to go to space. So 3, 2, 1, ignition. And up we go. A little bit less G-force this time, thankfully. Really, in the atmosphere, you don't want that many G-forces because it's inefficient. You see, we're getting slowed down by drag here. You got to be a little more careful with your drag. But we're actually getting out of the thickest part of the atmosphere pretty quickly. I mean, there goes the cloud layer. And we'll go ahead and jump the second stage now. And unfortunately, it's starting to spin a little irregularly, as these are wont to do sometimes, but looks like we're keeping it under control. After all, this one is mostly supposed to be just a hop up and down, so it's okay that it's not leaning over all the way. If we were trying to actually get into orbit, we'd need to be getting leaned over pretty close to horizontal by now. So, last stage time. Actually going to lower the thrust on this guy a little bit. Now, the last stage, we actually have a gimbal on our rocket here, meaning we can actually direct the flow of that and steer more efficiently. So that's why I've been able to move this one around a little bit. So now we're moving kind of southeastwards. You can see the curvature of the planet quite easily below us. On the real Earth, it would not be nearly this obvious up at 50 kilometers, but this planet is 4 times smaller. And I think we're going to have the velocity we need to make a suborbital hop here. Let me take a look. Yep, our apoapsis is going to be 202 kilometers, way above the top of the atmosphere. Beautiful. So, in fact, I think we may be out of atmosphere at this point. Let me take a look at my barometer. Toggle display, in vacuum, beautiful. So we logged the pressure data, confirming that it is a vacuum up here. We logged the temperature data, and we observe the mystery goo. We take a crew report, and we let Jeb go out and basically stand there in space. Takes an observation above the lowlands. Now, just so you don't worry, if you ask them to remove their helmets up in space, they just say, no, I won't do that. There is no atmosphere. So you're not going to inadvertently kill your Kerbals by telling them to take off their helmets in space. You may inadvertently kill them in other ways, but in that way, they're pretty safe. So let's hit the next stage on this ship here as we spin a little bit. And now we're just a capsule and a heat shield. And I'm going to speed up the time a little bit, see if we get over something that's not the lowlands before we re-enter the atmosphere. Well, this area looks pretty hilly. Let's try another observation. Yeah, this is the Midlands. So, another little bit of science. Now, whether it entirely makes sense for the scientific development of your program to be based on going up to space and looking at different places from above, not really. But you can sort of abstract it as, oh, they're doing test flights and testing the vehicle in different conditions and all that sort of thing. So now I've sped up the time frame. We're coming screaming in towards the atmosphere. It's a very good thing we have this heat shield. I think this craft would burn up otherwise because we have such a steep re-entry trajectory. It's not going to be that pleasant for Jeb either. He's going to have to deal with some heavy G-forces. But I mean, he's the first Kerbal in space. I think he can. I think he's willing to take that. So in we come. As you can see, the atmosphere is still very light. Not even ablating the heat shield yet. Here we go. Now the heat shield is starting to ablate away. We really could have gotten away with less heat shield here, to be honest. I probably should have set it to something like 80 or 60 ablator level. But the ship, you can see I can turn off control and it's pretty stable. I think that was our other part of the ship that just crashed there. Jeb just passed out from the G-forces. But we are now getting out of the rapid deceleration regime. G-forces are returning to normal. And our pal Jeb is back. And not a moment too soon. Pretty soon we're going to want to deploy the parachute. Yeah, you can see over here it's gray. That means it's safe to deploy. If it were yellow, it means there's a chance it would break. If it was red, that would mean it would immediately be burned off. Some kind of terrain glitch over there. Ignore that. We can just say it's a canal. And I think I'll skip ahead here to the landing. And we've made it back to the green hills of Kerbin. I'm going to have Jeb get out here and take a surface sample of the local ground. And now I've got to get back in our ship, which is for some reason sliding away. I don't have to do this, but this way I can recover them both as one unit. And now we recover the vessel. And we've got 72 science to play with. So, purchase the next stuff on this tier, some better winglets, nice radial decouplers, some nice nose cones to make us a little more aerodynamic, fuel tanks that are just tiny, nice big solid fuel boosters, liquid engines that don't have gimbals, so they're a little lighter, and I think the specific impulse is a little better. And that's all we have the points for now. But I think that should be enough to get us a proper orbit if we work with it well. So that's what we'll do next time, is do a proper orbit over Kerbin. And that should get us enough that we can start maybe building some basic probes and sending them out to the moon and Minmus. So this is Strategy Miscellany signing off for now. We'll see you later. Thank you very much for watching.